A Step Backward for Civil Rights, Chapter 19. In Chapter 18, we covered the time period 1879 through about 1914, but we focused on the politics of Georgia during that time period. In this chapter, we're going to focus more specifically on the issue of civil rights for Georgians. The images that you see in front of you are mostly taken in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, which is later than the time period we're studying, but those signs were possible because of laws made during the time period that we're studying. So we're going to be talking about how the Jim Crow laws came to be in effect. How did those laws come to be in effect? Um, in in the 1890s and the early 1900s, Southern states, including Georgia, passed laws to create a second class, separate, and inferior position for African Americans. They were somewhat like the black codes of Reconstruction that you already know about. What these laws did in the South was make the practice of segregation legal. There was discrimination in lots of different places, but in the South, um, discrimination was part of the legal system. Tomorrow in class, we'll talk about where the term Jim Crow laws come from, and we'll talk about this political cartoon and how it demonstrates the whole idea of a second class citizenship. The law that made separate but equal facilities possible was, or the Supreme Court ruling was Plessy versus Ferguson, which was in 1896. It's a Supreme Court decision. In 1896, in Louisiana, railroad cars were segregated by law. Homer Plessy, who, although he was mostly white, was still classified technically as black, he challenged the law on the grounds that it violated the 14th Amendment. Remember, that's the amendment that says states can't pass laws limiting citizens' rights based on their color. Well, railroad cars were segregated in 1896 in Louisiana. He challenges Louisiana's law, saying it violates the 14th Amendment. The U.S. Constitution, the U.S. Supreme Court says in their ruling that public places could be separate but equal. So, this doctrine, the separate but equal doctrine, is what allows Southern states to begin to and continue to separate all kinds of public facilities. And they can do that legally up until 1954. How did schools get segregated? Well, part of it is a Supreme Court decision that involved Georgia schools. In 1899, the U.S. Supreme Court said that Richmond County could keep a white high school open but close Ware High for African Americans. So, and they used the Plessy versus Ferguson doctrine, separate but equal. What happened was that there was a white high school and a black high school, and Richmond County, which is in Augusta, said they were going to close the high school for African Americans. People brought a lawsuit saying you can't do that because even the Supreme Court says you have to have separate but equal. But the Supreme Court said No, not really. It's okay for them to close Ware High School, even though that will make things separate and unequal. So they said, yes, you can close the school. And so that meant that, yes, things are separate, but they don't have to be equal. In this case, white high school students in Richmond County had a school and African American students did not. So in this case, this the Richmond Board of Education is what southern states use to segregate schools. Because of the Jim Crow laws, lives of black and white Southerners become more and more separate. Some examples: African Americans could not eat at store lunch counters, swear on the same Bible as whites, use the same water fountains or restrooms, go to the same public parks or pools, or sit in the same sections of theaters. There were also unspoken rules about how white and black Southerners acted. Um, no matter how well educated or wealthy African Americans were, they were considered inferior to whites by most whites. Lynching was an issue between 1882 and 1930. Over 450 Georgians were lynched. Almost all of them were African American. We'll explore a website tomorrow in class and see some statistics on lynching. We'll talk more about it. Lynching is when a mob of people murders someone. Now, what was the African American response to segregation? Well, lots left the South. Some moved west with the Homestead Act. Some moved to a new country in Africa, Liberia. And many, many, many thousands moved north as part of the Great Migration. They were looking for jobs and trying to escape the Jim Crow laws in the South. There were two main leaders of the African American community during this time period: Booker T. Washington, who was born a slave, went on to found the Tuskegee Institute. He believed that reconciliation of the races would be a gradual process and that education was the key. He spoke in 1895 at the International Cotton Exposition in Atlanta. It was called the Atlanta Compromise Speech, and it was praised by white leaders. They liked his sort of go slow approach to reconciliation between the races. He didn't advocate for confrontation. We're going to read that speech in class, so expect to hear more about that. The other leader was W.E.B. Du Bois. Unlike Washington, he was born free and grew up in the North. He encouraged college for African Americans, the talented 10th. He thought we should take the 10% most promising students and really focus on developing them leaders as the black community. In 1903, he published The Souls of Black Folk, and you've read a quote from that in one of our earlier lessons about sharecroppers and tenant farmers and how many of them ended up the year in debt. He was a leader of the Niagara movement and a founding member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909. We're going to be talking more about him in class tomorrow, too.